Okay. Hopefully we have to extend our Zoom recording link. I think we've got like a terabyte of recordings somewhere telling us to delete some eventually. But as you all know, we do record all these, and they're becoming actually more and more valuable as more partners come to the table. So just wanted to share that with you. So welcome everybody on this strange day, strange week I don't know about you, but I feel very much sort of bifurcated, sort of trying to focus on work and doing stuff here and house, family, and recognizing we're in just an unprecedented world, the war going on that could escalate any moment. So it's been a long time since that. So I just need to acknowledge that. I've been doing that on all my calls. And I know everyone's kind of carrying that heavy weight as well. So I think it's important to acknowledge that as we go do our work today, but we got to push forward while we can. So with that said, let me share, we got a couple new people on the call today, and let me see if I can share our agenda here. Where did I put the agenda? Hang on one second here. Thought I had it up and running. Yeah, there it is. Okay, so I just want to kind of go over with folks just to show you what we're doing. We got a couple new people on the call today with us, which is great. The featured topic today, as you saw in the note, is will be provided by Kate Chappert and Jim Pasquale on the Kantara initiative, and particularly around kind of what they do. I've asked for sort of an overview of it for us to think about from identity management perspective, and then they're going to dive into trust marks and consent receipt, all super interesting stuff, and just more and more relevant to the conversations that we're having around both Unify in general, and also more broadly to the consent work that we're doing. It's great to be here to be able to talk about that. We've got a few updates that on some of the project Unify status that I'll ask folks to talk about. There's a link here to the weekly updates as well that Amanda continues to provide to us, which is a great resource. I won't review these, but there are some things in particular. Maybe Brian, when you speak a little bit about the direct trust, they're approaching what is it, 945 million exchanges in 2021. So that's an exciting area that we're thinking about as well. I'm just thinking here, anything in particular. I think I mentioned to you folks last week that we met with the Office National Coordinator with Mickey Tripathi and Stefan Konya and Steve Posnick and others about the work on consent, and gotten a lot of very positive support and interest in it. I think that ONC is ready to sort of stop kicking that proverbial consent can down the road, so to speak, and are seriously thinking about how to move forward on that. So very encouraged by their willingness to participate and to join us in that. And also, I think I mentioned it too, but Mickey also agreed to join Jim and I on the European Social Network presentation, assuming that there is a presentation come June. But one of the requirements for that was to have a state or federal person, and Mickey enthusiastically agreed to participate in that. So I think that's a testament, both their interest and also to be able to spread this work more broadly across not only the US, but also across the world. And I know many of you are involved in initiatives that do go beyond the borders of these United States here. So that was pretty exciting. We're waiting to hear more about planning the spring workshop on consent. We talked about it a little bit, and I'm expecting that will ramp up in the next little while. one of the things we talked about was actually, really using this group as a resource for that, for the planning, and then for the delivery of that workshop, which right now looks like it'll be about a half a day in multiple different tracks that we'll be able to go through. So ideally, that will be a terrific opportunity and place to share what we're learning. And we'll have some good practice because we'll be presenting this at a couple of places, a couple of conferences over the next couple of months as well. So that's pretty exciting. I think we have a few new people. I've been having a number of conversations with folks in California, also with the Center for Data Technology. They do a lot of work on privacy. And some of the other folks we've been fortunate enough to work with on our interoperability training program I've mentioned in the past, and been inviting them to the table to kind of just get oriented to the work that's going on here. So I'm just looking here to do a quick intro. Serena, I think can't remember if you've been on the call before. I don't think so, but if you don't mind, you just say hello and sort of give us your coordinates. That'd be great.
Yeah, sure. Yes, I have been on this call a couple of times. My name is Serena Mack. I'm from Drummond Group, which is a testing and certification body for EHRs. On my side job, I also help facilitate the Protecting Privacy to Promote Interoperability work group, which is kind of doing a little bit of tangential work to here. So I like to log in and see what you guys are up to.
That's great. Appreciate that. I've been seeing a lot of you. Are your meetings, because I know they're on my calendar, and it probably would be worthwhile for an update at some point. But are they? What's the frequency of those meetings, if you know offhand?
Yeah, so we have our kind of what we call our large group meeting, which is once a month on Tuesday mornings, on the first Tuesday of the month. And then we have other smaller work groups that meet throughout the month. We have a legal and policy group, another ethics group, implementation and usability group. And then we are also just starting to kick off our patient perspective work group, which we're really excited about.
Oh, that's great. Okay, so we should keep tuned to that, and we can, of course, help promote that in our newsletters and stuff like that.
Absolutely.
Stay closely attuned to that.
Oh, yes, thanks, Rita. There's also the standards and terminology group. I knew I was forgetting one.
Yeah, at some point, I know, Brian, you've been engaged with many of the standards groups and terminology and ontology, so I'm sure there's continuing to be linkages there, but we ought to sort of double back and make sure we're not duplicating efforts there, or at least building on those efforts. I think that would be great.
Try to get to the PP2PI meetings as often as I can.
Yes.
Unfortunately, we tend to sort of double book me a little bit. So
oh, it's a good day when it's only double booked. So it gets more complicated with the triple booking there.
I used to try to have a meeting in each year. And I realized that my mental health was worth more than making sure that I made it to every single meeting.
Yeah. Yes, that is definitely crazy making to be on more than one call at a time. We also have some colleagues here from our Blue Path folk, our colleagues in California, who are supporting the state in their whole person care initiative, who we're going to hear from next week in some detail. There's so many overlaps with what they're trying to do, just a massively ambitious program at the state to really bring whole person care to all 58 counties. So they've graciously accepted to kind of give us an update, because they're also involved with connecting their HIEs and a whole bunch of other stuff that has relevance. And we've had a conversation with at the state level about bringing them into this work as well through John Ohanian and the group that's actually kind of overseeing the architecture and the technology around this stuff. So it's exciting to bring them to the conversation. So Ciara, can I ask you to say hello? I think, is Robbie on the phone? Great.
Hi, Daniel. Thank you. Yeah, I'm with Blue Path Health. We help manage the Connecting for Better Health Coalition in California, as you were talking about. And as a coalition, we're working to help the state achieve statewide health information exchange, and really interested in supportive of this work that's going on with Project Unify. And my colleague Timmy Leslie will be presenting next week. Hi, Jim.
Lot of overlaps here. Anyone else from your group? Is Robbie on the group, or did he jump off? Let's see him.
I'm not sure if you could make it today. I think he had a
Oh.
conflict, unfortunately.
No problem. And James.
Hey, excuse me. Thanks for inviting me. My name is James Johnson Jr. I'm an analyst in California in local government, Solano County, which is in Northern California, kind of between Oakland and Sacramento. And I have Solano County was the recipient of the Kresge Foundation, a grant that we have around integrating health and human services data. I'm so very happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, James. And apologize if anyone else that's new to the call, just to, you know, I think everybody else has been here before, so that's great. Before I move to the sort of the work group status, anybody have info that they want to share quickly that's going on that's particularly relevant or interesting? Feel free to pop in now.
Hey, Daniel, it's Pooja. Can you hear me?
Yes.
If anyone's going to Vive next week, we've got a couple of sessions on e-consent in the Interop Showcase Pavilion. So we've got a presentation on Tuesday, I think it's at 3 Eastern, where I'll be actually presenting some of the findings from the report and just some work we've been doing at Point of Care Partners. And then right after that, we have a panel with Jim Sinclair, as well as Paul Wilder from Commonwealth. And, oh, sorry, I just lost my third panelist. Jim, help me out here. My brain just completely on the call. Oh, Shane McNamara, sorry, from Smile CDR and BPM Plus.
Yes, yeah, I couldn't get off mute fast enough. Shane and I are part of BPM Health, and for those who know, Mary Kratz and IOI and Myhin are working on BPM Plus Health e-consent models too with Pooja and myself. So.
Yeah, so we're excited about that. So if anyone on the call is going to Vive, that's going to be happening all on Tuesday afternoon, starting at 3 in the Interop, in their Interop Pavilion.
Do you know if people can just dial in, or do they have to be registered for the conference?
You have to be registered. I've just realized, didn't realize this, but I think you've got, there's access online and in person, although I'm not sure on the presentations in the Interop Showcase. So I can find out about that and just drop a note. But I know there's kind of both.
Great.
For that session.
Well, that'll be great. We'll love to hear how that goes and the kind of response to it and responsiveness to it. So it's exciting as the momentum builds up here a bit. So with that, let me turn it over to Brian to sort of lead us on the work group updates.
Sure. And this is, I was planning on doing this with Eric. It looks like he is on vacation this week.
Yes.
As most of you know, we had, I should back up. This is not so much a work group status update as much as it's a National Science Foundation Open Knowledge Network update that applies to work that we're doing within our work groups. As most of you know, we made some submissions through Paul Wormley, who's on, for a couple of new use cases, user stories in our terminology, one for a decarceration to community use case in which we put together a service plan, a care plan for somebody coming out of prison back into a community, and what human services, social services were they going to need in order to support themselves once they get back out of prison. And the other was a family reunification after incarceration use case. These were submitted along with a NEEM ontology use case and an IGIS use case into what was a 3-day initial workshop for this open knowledge network process, we'll call it. And the 3-day workshop process was kind of a mix and filter event involving about 100 different subject matter experts in ontologies, data modeling, different specific information domains, various government agencies and organizations, many universities involved. And in the process of analyzing the various use cases that were submitted from multiple different places, including our 3 or 4, what we ended up with were 3 different use cases that I think we have a direct interest in. One being the NEEM ontology being pursued by Tom Carlson and Eric and myself and Paul Wormley and about 8 other folks from the ontology community that have come together and said, we care about putting together a good ontology for NEEM. We've ended up with a consent services use case, independent of, it was originally associated with the decarceration use case. We ended up with that separate from the decarceration use case as a generally usable infrastructure component. And I did that because I kind of read the tea leaves and saw that there was strong interest by NSF in infrastructure projects that might be generally usable, and not as strong an interest in our decarceration or reunification user stories. And we ended up with, I did manage to save the decarceration and reunification use cases by merging them together and associating them with a number of other use cases that were being proposed, including homelessness knowledge network for cities, tracking homeless people, which I have some ethical concerns about, but we won't go there, and a tracking justice encounters use case for tracking the outcomes of various criminal and incarcerations. In any case, they are now going to be worked on over the course of the next month in separate little work groups. We've got 6 people interested in the decarceration reunification process. We've got a use case. We've got 6 people interested in electronic consent services. I believe that this is an open process. That is, if anybody else is interested in joining up on helping to refine the electronic consent services use case or the decarceration and reunification use case, I'm more than happy to have them join up with our project here. And then we're going to go through another at least 1-day workshop to evaluate the outcomes of all the work we do each month, and do another filtering event each month, with the goal to get to the best possible use cases and use case definitions by June, which ultimately will be considered for funding by the National Science Foundation in September. So that's the motivation for all of us, is can we turn around and get NSF funding to move forward on these consent services or move forward on a proof of concept for decarceration and family reunification, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, I'm sorry, Paul, I didn't mean to give short shrift to the NEEM ontology. And of course, get the NEEM ontology work funded as well. And so that has implications for us going forward in consent technology working group, ontologies working group, possibly the consent governance working group. And also, of course, in the user stories and use case working groups. I'm hoping to stand each of those groups up again in the next month to have us participate in the work for the NSF Open Knowledge Network. And I'm done. Thank you. Questions?
Paul, any commentary on the process that you've seen there, or?
Yeah, I just want to let everyone know that this was a very positive exchange of information, and Brian did a hell of a job in presenting the cases for some of these use cases and keeping them alive. And I'm very optimistic that this will turn out to provide some funding for some, if not all, of the use cases that we submitted. The feedback I'm getting offline from National Science Foundation is very, very positive. They very much appreciated what we all worked on to put in, and so this team has kind of dominated the discussions in many ways, and I think it's a good likelihood that some funding will emerge out of this and some attention on these issues. The consent management issue is one that piqued a lot of interest, and I think the decarceration and family unification combination was a brilliant idea. So I think the process now is kind of open-ended about how they refine these use cases, and within 90 days their intent is to have them well enough defined to then get into the details of submitting grant applications, I think.
I emphasize that the process they've used to date has been heavily oriented on, if you will, voting with your feet. They determined which use cases were going to move forward in the process over the course of those 3 days, based on whether or not they got 3 or 5 people to join the project and agree to work on it. So it's important for us to identify additional stakeholders, get them involved in helping to refine these projects.
Yes.
And hopefully get them basically invited to the next workshop so that they can help us, vote for these projects and keep them alive.
Right. I'm glad to see there's momentum there as well. It seems to be resonating in lots of places, which is great.
I can beat the drum, but I need people to march alongside me while I do so.
Hopefully there's a group that will do that. Briefly, I know that Eric is not here on ontologies and consent technology. Any updates that are relevant for the group to know about? I know they've got those highlighted.
Oh yes, we had an ontologies meeting, and forgive me, I've been so focused on the NSF workshop and other things that it has been completely wiped from my mind what we did. Is anybody else here on the meeting with me and Eric? Jim, do you remember what we did in the ontologies work group?
We talked about about running the standards through W3C. That's the most I remember.
Okay.
Eric holds all the secrets.
Okay. Well, we'll have to prohibit him from vacationing in the future when we want to report out there.
We need a session plan.
We did great work. It was a fun and exciting and vibrant meeting, and that's what I came away from the meeting.
Yeah, and I don't think he sent out notes with it either. So
not yet.
Okay. I'm
So
curious.
Back to you, Daniel.
Yeah, I was just curious from Serena's perspective if there's any linkages with the ontologies work that's happening, PP2PI and the work on the Unify ontologies group. You've connected those, so I'm assuming, Brian, you've got that in hand, but is it requiring, or is it useful to have a more substantive sort of deeper dive conversation around that at some point?
I was just having this conversation, was it earlier today or yesterday? Yesterday, I think, that the folks in PP2PI have done a great job in really getting into the nitty-gritty of user stories for consent and data segmentation for privacy. And it's something that we should really be leveraging as we move forward in consent governance and also, of course, consent technology.
Right.
So Brian, that's incorporating DS4P into the consent framework. Is that what you're saying?
Certainly keeping it in mind.
Right.
And I do realize that we have multiple different technological threads going on across the industry with regard to consent. Some fine-grained, like data segmentation for privacy, some more document record oriented, and maybe not quite appropriate for getting down into the field and data element level, fine-grained privacy control.
Yeah, no, I think continued effort to map the DS4P is of value. So yeah, that's useful to put in there. So, and I agree with you, Rita. I don't think PP2PI is exclusively focused on DS4P, but I'm personally not ready to throw DS4P out. I think it's potentially functional. I think it just needs to be. I think it needs to be added upon or built upon a bit. So.
Yeah, let me kind of chime in here. There's two sides of DS4P, right? There's DS4P CCD for the CCDs and DS4P Fire. We're definitely looking more on the Fire side of things. We've got Kathleen Connor, who's heading the Standards and Terminology Group. For those of you who don't know her, she's over at HL7 and is amazing. She's kind of deep in a lot of this stuff. But I mean, the really big thing that we're focused on is the granular segmentation of privacy. If that happens through DS4P, great. If that happens through other Fire tools, awesome. But I think we're really kind of looking at the entire playing field.
Well, that's good. And I'm not necessarily involved in that, Serena, but I would like to get engaged specifically because some of the things we've talked about in identity here in this group and using decentralized architectures are a more robust, potentially more robust approach for facilitating granular consent with Fire than you'll get with OIDC, which we're using for most identity and OAuth 2. So happy to explore that.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, then. I just want, right before we sort of pivot to our presenters, anything more on the consent technologies that we haven't already spoken about, or we covered that? Okay, so.
More for me.
Okay, that's great. Well, thanks for those updates. I'm glad to see things are continuing to move along. And I'm really glad to be turning to this next part of our meeting here. I think I've actually, since I've since meeting Jim and then now with getting connected with Kay a number of months ago last year, we've wanted to actually focus more on Conterra and what they do relative to identity and consent and receipt and trust. And so, the fickle finger of fate brings us to today to shed a little bit more knowledge and information about that. I know we had a lot of conversation when we had the FIDO presentation a month ago or so, whatever. So it's kind of teed it up. And so, so with that, let me turn it over to Kay and to Jim Pasquale from Quintara. And really glad, Kay, that you guys can join us and are able to help us think through some of this stuff. So
Okay,
take it away.
thank you. Thank you.
Yes.
Well, first I have to tell people, because Daniel, I can tell you do not speak French. So my last name is actually pronounced Chopard.
Wow.
It's a, exactly. Kind of like the CH in champagne.
Okay.
But anyway, I am the executive director at the Quintara Initiative, and I've known Daniel and others actually for a while. In previous life, I've done a lot of other things. I've only been with Quintara for less than a year, about 8 months, and so I'd like to give you a little bit of the overview about the organization and some of the things that we're focused on and sort of what we bring to the table. And can I
gave you
share
the
my screen?
should be able to.
Okay. Let's see if
Got
I
it.
can. You got it?
Yep.
Okay.
You can see.
And so, I'd like to give you just a little bit of the background and sort of the high level, 50,000 foot view. Jim Pasquale, who's also going to be speaking with me, he's going to do the bulk of the talking. He is a longtime leader in the Quintara Initiative. He's had a number of different hats. He's very expert, I will tell you, has a lot of substantive knowledge. And I think what he's going to bring to the table will be probably in some ways far more informative in terms of what this group is working on and trying to accomplish and so on. But just to give you the context, I wanted to give you some of the background about the Quintara Initiative itself. To start with, we are a nonprofit membership organization. We are a 501c6, so our members are generally individuals and corporations and a few nonprofits who all work in the identity world. And we focus a lot on assurance because we have an assurance accreditation type program and value. And I'm going to run through just a few of these things briefly to give you the background. This is our mission: to grow and fulfill the market for the trustworthy use of identity and personal data.
Okay, I think you just need to advance your slide.
Oh, it's advanced on my screen. It's not advanced on yours?
No.
Can't see the mission?
It's on the side screen there, yeah. But it's maybe try to click on the presentation mode.
I am on presentation mode.
Ooh, okay.
You can't see the presentation mode? Yikes.
Not perfectly yet. Is anybody else seeing it, or is it just my computer?
No, it's not coming up, Kay.
So what should I do?
Okay, you need to, so over by the slide bar that adjusts the size, you'll see a little button just to the left. That's your presentation mode button.
Or it says 103, 103%, right to the little screen there. Now keep going, move your cursor all the way to the right. Down.
Due
all the way
south,
up.
due south.
Due south, yes.
Oh,
There's
well,
nothing.
If you're
There's
in
nothing-
presentation
Yeah.
on your side, did you
Yeah.
perhaps share your window instead of sharing your screen?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I don't know. Is that what happened?
yeah, maybe
Sometimes that happens because the presentation mode sometimes opens in like a different screen that you have to share specifically. You might be able to share your screen and it'll work.
so on the bottom, it says share screen.
So I opened it like this and then I went to play. So maybe I can't do that. Do I just need to leave it like this?
No, you need to go to click on that slideshow button.
It is on the mission now.
Yeah, it does say mission.
I think that's because Kay just selected that file.
Yeah.
Kay, if
Yeah.
you go to the lower right corner of the window, you'll see next to the minus sign, there you go. That should be your presentation button.
Is that working for you guys now? I'm seeing the presentation, but I saw it last time too, so.
Okay, so it's not, but I think we can, I don't know how many slides you have.
Actually,
I
yeah,
don't
if you
have
go
that
to the
many.
button immediately to the left of the one you just clicked on, it should adjust the screen.
I can't, I have to
Again.
go out and come back in, I'm afraid.
These virtual meetings.
Yes, I'm so sorry. I
Okay.
haven't had this
Okay.
issue before.
It's mandatory that 1 out of every 10 meetings fail. It's just like,
So what is it somebody just suggested?
The button,
Reading
yes,
view?
click on that one, yep.
Now, can you see the slide?
Try the button next to that one to the left.
Oh my goodness.
just jiggle the handle.
Unplug it once.
I would recommend
There you go.
You got it.
the machine.
There you go.
Okay, but now I have no idea because I have no buttons to advance it. Well, let's see if I can do it this way.
Up and down arrow keys.
There you go. I just moved.
I think you just use the page down key. on your
Okay, well,
keyboard.
I also have a little bar that shows me each of the slides, so I just pressed on the next slide.
Okay,
So, sorry about that. Well, so you saw the mission, right? Which is very focused on trust, identity, personal data, and really those concepts in the marketplace.
Right.
And we're not focused on specific verticals. In fact, one of the reasons I have this slide in here is to talk about, why are we doing this? Because, citizens, as you all know, have to manage multiple IDs. There is often no interoperability between sectors, which falls squarely into what Project Unify and the Stewards of Change Institute has recognized as trying to address. There's a considerable lack of transparency. And what we're seeing is more and more applications, which only increase that complexity. So to, the citizen, to the normal person trying to be able to interact and conduct business and do all these things, it just increases confusion and at the same time raises security concerns, and that creates the lack of trust. And so what we're trying to do is find ways to address that lack of trust. And we do that by trying to enable trust and interoperability. If I can say the words here. And the organization really has sort of two different ways that we work towards this. And you'll see in this, on the bottom line here, the foundation is that we do have an identity assurance program. For those of you who are familiar with NIST 863.3, we provide accreditation for identity proofing, authentication, and federation for at the different assurance levels, IAL 1, 2, 3, AAL 1, 2, and 3, FAL 1, 2, and 3, and so on. And that's sort of a foundation, if you will. We are the only ones that I'm aware of in the country, and perhaps even broader than that, who are doing that for NIST 863.3. We have a trust framework. We have established criteria to assess against. So it's a very rigorous program. At the same time, we work with other standards organizations, with other organizations like yourselves, to really try to bring that substantive expertise to bear to help in the development of criteria and standards that feed into a lot of other work that is happening in a lot of different verticals. And you see all of the different sort of parts, the different stakeholder groups, if you will, that need to come together for that. This is to try to give a sense of what exactly we're doing. I will say that so relying parties look to us for that interoperability of trust frameworks, improving project quality, return on investment. Solution providers look to us for that, like credentialed service providers, look to us for that accreditation, for consistent standards that really provide a stable framework. And then all of this should feed into working with consumers, and we're actually engaged in some new areas to try to really hone in on that and provide more support in this whole cycle. Here we go. So I feel bad because I don't want to take away from Jim, who's got so much more to say. This is how we're structured. We have a board of directors, obviously, as a nonprofit. I'm the executive director. You see that we have liaison with other groups like ISO and many other standards bodies and others. I mean, groups like you could be listed in there. We do a lot with the Karen Alliance. In fact, you probably know, those of you involved with the Karen Alliance, in their pilot, they are requiring their vendors to either be PKI certified or certified for IL2 or AL2 through us. So we partner very closely with them. Our assurance program is overseen, if you will, by an assurance review board that provides the final review of the third-party assessments that are done and recommends the issuance of a trust mark, actually, if they meet those criteria. And then you'll see it sort of split into what we call our leadership council. And the leadership council are the chairs of these work groups. And Jim is on there. In fact, I think he might be the vice chair now of the leadership council. And he's going to talk in more detail with you about those work groups, what they're doing, what they're moving towards, how they're feeding into the market, if you will. And so I'm going to leave that to him. On the other side, our program, as I said, is our trust operations. And that's, like I said, where we have our assurance program. I don't know if any of you follow what happens in other parts of the world. The UK government announced today that we have been selected as one of 5 groups who will become certification bodies for a new pilot accreditation program that they're doing in the UK. So we'll be working with the UK government on their trust framework as well in the coming months. So we're continuing to expand and grow our program, and we work with governments in other nations into Canada, Australia, France, New Zealand, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's probably, like I said, I don't want to dwell on this. You'll see us at conferences, other work groups, the assurance program, our partnerships. This was just to try to explain, because we have in some ways a unique membership, because we have corporate members, and then we also have individuals, and they really provide a lot of thought leadership. And I think the mix has really made for a strong organization. So sorry about those technical issues, but thank you for listening. And I hope that gives you some sense of the organization itself and our focus. We're focused obviously on standards, we're focused on trust, we're focused on identity. So
yeah, so Kay, before we pivot to Jim, just a question around applicability and the standards, and this is really for my sake, I don't, and others perhaps, so it's not, can that be applied in all different realms? So much of our conversation is always around healthcare, critically important. But as you know, bless you, we're focused in other areas. And so I'm wondering how this transposes or translates to sort of the trust environment that we might have, we encounter in sort of other than healthcare areas. And is that something that you guys are thinking about, or Jim going to talk about that for us, or maybe that's a conversation we need to come back to at another time?
Well, I don't know if this would be helpful to you. So in the US, right, we'll just talk about our work in the US. So the federal government is required by OMB, right? They've issued orders that all federal agencies must use identity providers, assurance providers, who are certified in identity assurance levels 2 typically, or authentication assurance level 2 or above. And so that means anyone who's working with a federal agency on identity proofing in any of those areas should have that certification, because OMB requires that federal agencies do that. And so a lot of the private vendors who come to us to go through the program, and there are others, login.gov is signed up for the program, right? So it's not like, it's very broad. And so in that sense, it applies to all kinds of different things. So that might be the Veterans Administration, that might be the Justice Department, that might be the Social Security Administration, right? All of those agencies are using private vendors who have those certifications. So in that sense, it's very broad. And at the same time, I'm working, I don't know how much it was done in the past, but working very closely with the state CIOs, who are also looking at incorporating that into their RFPs for all the kinds of identity services that they're now having to get. We partner with the National Association for the Vital Records folks, right? And they have a whole component on digital identity. And they have me talking at their conferences and meeting with their work groups and all that kind of thing. So there's a lot of different places and a lot of different verticals. The financial industry obviously is another one. But this accreditation is about, does the technology meet the NIST standard? And also what we're looking at in the assurance program is what are the policies you have in place? What is the governance? So it's not just that your technological solution is, protects privacy and is secure and all of these things, but do you have the governance and the policy in place so that it is used properly? So you can have a solution, but if you don't follow the rules that you've created, then it doesn't meet the standards either. I don't know if that makes sense, but so it's showing up in a lot of different places. And I think there are a lot of different industry verticals where identity has always been a part of what they do, but they didn't think of it that way. So I think what's happening now is now, I think in some ways, I don't know that the healthcare industry thought about it, identity in great depth, until a little bit more recently. They thought about it in different ways. They looked at it in a different way. So I think that it's really expanded as more and more people are recognizing that, attack vectors often start with identity and identity proofing, right? And that's true in, name just about any potential sector. So that feels like a long-winded answer. Did I answer that question or not?
Yeah, it sounds like there's a space for everyone can get a ribbon at some point. We may need to architect that for some of the spaces we're involved with, but let me not distract further. But I wanted to keep that in mind as we're thinking about justice and education and housing and social and all those places which I don't think they have had that sort of that same level of rigorous sort of authentication certification for security and standards. And that's going to be really important as we go forward, as you well know. So
well, we actually work with quite a few universities, and and on our assurance review board is actually a representative from academia. So so I think there are some, I just don't think it's pervasive.
Yeah.
And like I said, I think for what, at least let me just say from my background, which is more in the criminal justice world, right? I remember going to meetings years ago when I would make some comment about identity, and a lot of people were like, well, so what, we're talking about the identity of the defendant? No, there's all kinds of places in the system where it makes a difference that you know who you're talking to. Is this the victim? Is there anybody else in the room that shouldn't be present with the victim? I mean, that's the identity of folks, right? And I just think that in some of those, they just haven't historically thought of it in the same way. But I bet if we gave them use cases, they'd be like, oh yeah, is that what you call that? So anyway, and I see Jim St. Clair's made a good point in the chat there that identity is the foundation of zero trust architecture, which is very true. So, okay, I'll shut up.
For 30 seconds within healthcare, I spend a lot of time talking about identity, as does other folks, of course. And the first thing they think of by default is patient matching, which is fine. But the embodiment of the concept of an identity and a persona of a patient still doesn't always resonate to them, and how the characteristics of their identity are hand in hand with their data.
Exactly. Thank you.
Right.
More well said and shorter than what I had to say. But yes, I think that's exactly.
You're far too kind.
All right. Well, I would really love for Jim Pasquale to talk, because he's really got a lot of good information. I think that'll be helpful to all of you.
Over to you, Jim.
So that's great. Thank you, Kay. Thank you, Jim. Jim, I couldn't agree more around identity being the foundation for zero trust. Conversation for another day. It's all about authenticity, confidentiality, and privacy. And that's a triad that's a difficult one to obtain from my perspective anyway. Well, from there, let me share my screen. Hopefully I won't have the same issues as Kay had.
You do, I'll
A
check to
lot
make
of-
sure we paid the bill last month.
A lot of what I'm going to go over is a lot of what I'm going to go over. Can everybody see the presentation view?
Yeah, we see it.
Okay, great. So I'm going to go through a lot of this stuff very quick. And so from a housekeeping perspective, I'd like to ask anyone who has a question to please jot the question down in the chat. And then before the meeting ends, we'll hit the proverbial ellipsis button and save the chat window. And we'll be able to answer the questions in lieu of the amount of time that we have left. So we all understand where we are today. Again, I'm Jim Pasquale. I'm an infrastructure guy, been in the infrastructure software business, I think, way longer than Jim Sinclair would like to recognize or remember, pun intended. And the idea of moving forward from consent receipt is a centricity one built around the notion that a personal data use record framework that moves consistently with an individual when data is in motion and when data is at rest provides the best solution for consent in the long run. So again, I'm happy to make this whole presentation available to everyone. This is just a little bit of information about the different work groups and what those work groups are working on. So there's the mobile driver's license, there's the advance notice and consent receipt, which builds on the current consent receipt specification, specifically around data governance and interoperability around data governance. These two organizations are in the process of merging, so they're are not as accurate as we'd like them to be as they merge together. Their charters, I'm sure, will make a lot more sense. There's a lot of overlap and at the same time, very specific things that both organizations are working through. There's the firework group, and their work is really around building a registry and an ecosystem. There's the identity insurance, which is pivoted themselves into a new set of principles that they're looking to incorporate in a specification. There is the work group that I charter called the Information Sharing Interoperability Work Group. It is the result of furthering the original Kantara consent receipt and the notion that or the conclusion actually that we came to with consent receipt is that there are too many different attributes across different kinds of consent to build an all-inclusive consent receipt. from jurisdiction to types of data, the sensitivity of the data itself. And so the whole idea that was brought through by Andrew Hughes, who is really the person that saw an opportunity to create this personal data use record, which would produce a receipt that could be used by both sides of the conversation, with that conversation being the requester and the responder for sharing data. And okay, why did this stop? Then there's the UMA group for Universal Management Authorization, user managed authorization, and their model is around authorizing on an ongoing basis permissions for access to owner content on a case-by-case basis. But the words matter, and interoperability, integration, and interface are very different things. They mean different things to different individuals. When we talk about interoperability, we talk about interoperability in the example of the modern mobile communication systems that we've all come to love and hate, called cell phones. And interoperability to us is much like what the ITU invented many years ago with a common call data record, whereby it doesn't matter what device you're on, it doesn't matter what network you're on, it doesn't necessarily matter who you're connected to on a regular basis or not. Information and data should move seamlessly and go beyond simple exporting and importing and remapping, which are what interfaces traditionally do. Integration is usually customized by some third party. And if anyone is interested, I wrote a piece about the three a long time ago. I recently posted them on a new website that I'm putting up, and I'm happy to share that information with anybody. But really what we're here to talk about today around consent and the consent receipt, or a profile for a consent receipt, is within the personal data use record framework. So this framework is really developed and defined as a simple approach and a standardized way to provide a person with a receipt. And that receipt comes out of a record. And just like you go to a store and get a receipt, you have an artifact that allows information to be captured so that you can always go back and look at what was transacted. Now, as I'm sure everyone else on the call may be much like myself, we take receipts and we tend to stick them in a shoebox and forget about them forever. But in a digital world, all of that has changed. And a lot of that has changed in the fact that in the digital world, in our digital selves, there are lots of times where we interact with companies and then those companies have breaches. And if you look at some of the requirements in the GDPR and the CCPA, the data protection officer, is required within a certain time frame to notify people and individuals about a breach. Probably the US has been the slowest to implement and come around to that kind of notification, but it is a requirement. So, you know, that's the way we look at a particular receipt, and the receipt itself typically doesn't have any kind of personal data. So here's an example of a company that actually took our specification. So this would be consent receipt version 1.1. And each time, excuse me, each time an individual visits the Midnight web store, a receipt is generated, and they are able to download or have a copy of that receipt for their keeping, and be able to store it in a certain way. But the real goal to providing an end-to-end solution of a conversation or a relationship between a requester and a responder is to provide a system, a framework that covers these particular points. So when you look at the flow, and I had to take this particular diagram off another presentation, and so when I popped it on the background, it didn't come out as well as I would have liked it to. But on the top left, we have service providers who make offers. We have individuals who take advantage of those offers. Today, most everything is a contract of adhesion. You either accept everything or not. Of course, if you want access to a service, you have to agree to the terms. There's really no negotiation that's provided in between. But really the key piece is the record keeping and the exchange that both parties find a value in, right? So the agreement flow really shows the capability of the interaction between parties, and the record that then gets generated can provide the kind of dynamic receipt that I think everyone is looking for. So there are other countries that require by law that a receipt be provided, and the receipt itself does not provide an end-to-end solution that is available on a usable format for an individual to be able to go back and look at it. So again, you know, a lot of what we look to do in the personal data use record is provide the kind of output that allows the individual to, or company, to build a dashboard that would allow an individual to then be able to go back and manage all of those different receipts. And that, excuse me again, and that really is the catalyst of why we're working and doing what we're doing on. So again, a little bit more about the agreement flow, the different components of the agreement flow, where personal data exists, where the receipt would come from, along with the record keeping once an agreement is established and looked at. So that's pretty straightforward. Again, a personal data receipt is a person's record. It's independent of the receipt issuer, so it's not like you have to go back to the website to see it. It does incorporate metadata, and it looks to providing the issuer their policy statements. They goal that we have in standardizing a personal data receipt is through the use of profiles. So we're encouraging companies to come to the ISI work group, much like one of the current efforts, one of the current projects called CR Web, which is a project team that is basically working on a architecture and a specification that would allow a company to enable, once you've agreed to their cookie policy, that you'll never see that cookie policy again until you revoke it. So an interesting approach to going to a website and not having to agree to their privacy cookie each and every time you go, unless you, of course, would choose to do so. This is just a quick overview of the specification. The individuals who worked on the specification, are two editors, which was really David Turner and Mark Lazar. Mark was more on the architectural side of things, where David really wrote the specification as the editor. As you can see, it was produced by the Consent and Information Sharing Work Group. That work group has been archived, and we've now split the effort between the personal data use record framework group, or inside of ISI, information sharing interoperability, and what is referred to as Anchor, which is the advanced notice and consent receipt, which was earlier in an earlier slide. Of course, this is a lot of the JSON, just to give people an idea of the intricacies, if you will, of actually generating a consent receipt. Here is a little bit more information of how a consent receipt is generated, and how it moves around. These are some of the original fields. We did not try to boil the ocean with the original consent receipt, and we recognize that there are too many other attributes across different, I call them verticals or industries. So healthcare is very different than retail. Retail is very, very different from website usage, et cetera, et cetera. And so from that, the whole idea of creating a framework was really put into place. But you can see that we provided the ability for a consent receipt to be extendable. Many companies like Airside and Peter Davis have done exactly that. They've added extensions to it. We welcome those companies to contribute back into the specification if they choose to. If they don't, they can more or less use it on their own. But again, what we really look for is defining the sharing contract and then creating the artifact or the reference of what that sharing contract was. This is some examples of a few different companies that have developed a consent receipt. Actually, I don't know if my pointer is actually going to work here, but the first privacy notice that you see to the left is actually Airside and what they did, creating consent receipt through their privacy notice. And then there's others. There's a company that I've worked with in the past called DigiMe. There was Consentry, Transmute, and a few others that were initial enablers of the consent receipt version 1.1. And so there we go. This is the whole idea of building a dashboard. Actually, it was done through a DataFund.io and a gentleman by the name of Jan Lundquist, and I'm bringing that up because they have furthered developing a dashboard to include blockchain. Was able to participate in a demo at the one of the monthly Leadership Council meetings where we actually saw a data sharing agreement be developed, be agreed upon, be certified, and then be placed on the blockchain. And I think one of the most intriguing parts of how it was accomplished or streamlined is through the concept of overlays, which a gentleman by the name of Paul Mills from Human Colossalis developed and then put in the public domain. He developed them for the pharmaceutical industry for when they do trials, and the whole idea of overlays is just a brilliant approach to being able to do real-time on-demand mapping. And yes, I see Jim is kind of chiming in. A lot of us know Paul, and we like the work that he's done, and we appreciate everything that he's put forward. So I put this slide in, but it really I think everybody at this point kind of gets what we're doing as far as a receipt. Of course, their importance of why use a receipt, that hopefully I've done a decent job articulating to everybody today. But most importantly, for this organization, like many other organizations, what will you invent next? What can the health around healthcare and the healthcare industry do with the current informed consent that is very much paper driven today, and further its acceptance like e-consent, where the individual is again at the center, being able to not only have visibility and see what their data is doing, but acknowledge and be able to revoke specific uses of that data. And that's where we are really driving to. And yes, Jim, the consent receipt it is a current appended standard in ISO 295 something or other. Andrew sits on that committee, and as we expand our roles at Kantara, and yes, and so does Jan. Jan frequently visits us at Kantara and participates in several different work groups, and we expect to see more from some of the inventive things that Jan works on. He clearly has his hands around what the issues are. And so again, here's certainly a way to get in touch with Kay or in touch with myself. I want to thank everybody, and I'm sure it looks like there are some questions that have come about, and let me check the time. We have a little bit of time left here.
Actually, if you guys are willing, we could go into what we call overtime here. So if you've got a few more minutes to look at sort of addressing some of the questions that are available here. But there's a couple things in the chat. Folks who put stuff in the chat, are there questions that you want to direct to Jim here? I know, Paul, you said something about, did Paul with this still? You might have jumped off. How are the legal components of this being addressed? Do you have a legal work group, as Paul Meister has requested or asked about?
Well, no, we don't have a formal legal work group, but we look for that expertise to be part of the different work groups that were mentioned up front. Okay, Kay is probably a little more versed in some of our goals as far as standing up a kind of legal work group. It's a very good observation. It's something that we have contemplated and tried to figure out, even in another organization called the Me to Be Alliance. We were, where I'm also a founding member. One of the things that we recognize very much up front is the fact that we're just a bunch of geeks, and we're trying to do good in the world, and we're trying to streamline, in many cases, the absence of regulations and laws in the digital world in such a way that it does no harm, or it provides it. Go ahead.
Jim, would you, yeah, I know you have a question, your hand up, and I'd also like it if you could sort of address the connection to the consent utility and how that might fit. Sort of, if you can help translate this.
The biggest challenge about a legal working group is that the laws in the US just don't cover this stuff. So Mark Lazar is Canadian, Jan Lundqvist is Norwegian, and Paul Knowles lives in Switzerland, originally British. And so a lot of the work they're doing in the ISO standards and additional work they're doing apply to GDPR, the DPA, laws we just don't have in the US. And not only that, but also principles of identity rights in the EU and others that either are explicit to the GDPR or implicit in their design and implementation. So we don't have a legal model in the US that represents the same sort of perspectives and values that consent receipts are designed around. And Europe in general is also moving more and more kind of gradually towards concepts of individual data stores and personal data stores and personal data records that are, space flight for what we're doing here. So you could take, for instance, the Bronx Rio consent model that we've looked at, and you could apply consent receipts to them, but it essentially will be providing receipts for consent and agreement for consent in a model where the individual is still not necessarily controlling their data per se, except agreement as to how the two parties test that they are sharing data.
Yeah, exactly, Jim, and that's why we use the term centricity, especially around these different emerging PIMs that we talked about last week. These personal information management systems, where the individual not only has access but rights to control their personal data. And who they share it with, when they share it with, their ability, the typical things that the GDPR talks about, the right to be forgotten, the right to correct, it's moving slowly. There are a handful of companies, and I'm sure Jim's very familiar with the My Data Operators effort and what's going on in My Data, which has basically built a kind of compliance around what it means to be a My Data operator, and what those requirements are for a company to be able to claim they are a My Data operator.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But I want to get back to Paul's observation and his comment. I know that, and I'm sure lots of people on the call are probably familiar with Adrian Grappa and some of the work he's doing in HIE1, which really looks to Paul's observation around primary health care, with the individual having agency and able to provide a public health process, whether it be statewide or federal. I don't want to say regulated, but I think it's a very feasible concept. It's a matter of making the user experience engaging enough that people want to pay attention to it and understand. And that's another big hurdle. I like to use my wife as an example. I love her dearly, of course. She has a 3-click rule. If she can't get something done in 3 clicks, she really can't all be that bothered. Now, we've extended that over the years to at least include another 2 additional clicks. But at the same time, she's kind of right. We as technologists understand the importance of granularity and how granularity makes a big difference. But at the same time, ease of use and a pleasurable user experience is kind of really important. And I think that's why in a lot of cases beyond what we're talking about today, these different dashboards will at some point come together. Some dashboards may have automated agents to them that act on a person's behalf for agencies or from an agency perspective. But at the same time, these dashboards will also allow individuals to go in and make changes to their particular preferences. It's probably one of the biggest reasons why you never put personal data on a blockchain, whether it's a permission blockchain or a permissionless blockchain. It's irrevocable, and so that could cause a lot of issues down the road when you start to think about personal data and what it really means. Does this model allow the owner? So the consent receipt as it exists today is generated from the upfront information that is collected that we saw back in the data flow once the agreement is met. A record in itself could at some point have an extension for de-identifying and creating an autonomy that would allow that PII to be excluded to the receiving entity. There are several companies as well, and one that is very close to the work that I have done in the past would be DigiMe. DigiMe has several solutions that allow an application developer to de-identify PII and then send the information along. Did I get the question right, Kristen?
Not exactly. I guess the reason I'm asking is that it seems that what lies behind this model is that you have two entities that explicitly want to share information. And we're making sure that you have a record of that happening, and that the agreement by the person whose information it is that or at least a place where they can track that happened. What I'm thinking of is in so many cases when we're talking about moving information across these various sectors, the folks in the other sector aren't necessarily asking for the information yet. They may have the technical capacity to receive it, but their workflow that they are asking for the information or are actively trying to gain that information because they have older workflows. And so the initiative then is either on the part of the person whose PII it is, or the potential sending entity to say, hey, entity 2, I really want to send you this information. And this person, or on the person who says, hey, entity 1, I really want you to send my information to entity 2. But entity 2 is not necessarily asking for it because they're used to operating without it. And unfortunately, this is just really, really common in health and social services. Whereas I think in other business models, the receiving entity, wants that information in order to, use it in some very specified fashion.
Well, so I think that one of the when I look at we refer to it as PERDU, the Personal Data Use Record Framework. When I look at the framework, I think what you're referring to is the negotiation part, where the notice of the use of data and or the potential passing on of data, which we call data, we refer to it as data in motion versus data at rest, right? So the entire ebbing and flowing of personal data, and when that personal data is moving, that today individuals, they really don't have any knowledge when PII is in motion or moves from one data processor to another data processor, kind of as an example. But the whole, again, I think this gets back to the.
So let me just give a simple example just within healthcare. So,
Okay.
We have our competing health systems, and all the information blocking rules, et cetera, are about this. But if I have a study done in one health system, but then I want to see a provider at a competing health system, and I want them to be able to access the results of that study, that competing health system is not interested in getting that information from health system one. They would rather that I repeat that study within their health system two, so that they can collect the dollars for that. So they're actually not motivated to receive my information.
Yeah, there's nothing in the consent receipt model you
Extreme
see.
example where in fact they might be resisting receiving the information, versus just simply being sort of unaware that they can, which I think is more common when we're talking about moving it between health and social services, for example.
Yeah, there's nothing in this consent receipt model that accounts for an organization not wanting to get data or use data.
Okay.
I just have a simple question. Would this receipt work? So if I'm a person or parent and I'm giving consent, I'm signing our user interface, our consent tool, and I'm authorizing the use of my kid's educational record or his or her attendance record. So I comply with that. I put in the information. I understand informed consent. I sign it. I hit go, sends it off to our utility. At that point, should I think about it the same way of saying, well, okay, now that's happened, that utility is going to send back a receipt saying, yeah, we got your information, it's stored. And when and if it's actually accessed by a provider, I would get another receipt saying, oh, that data moved somewhere else. Are both those cases true?
Currently, for each instance of data use, a new receipt is generated currently.
So it would tell me as the consumer that I've submitted it's a confirmation that I've provided my consent for the use of this information. So there's no discrepancy between what I thought I said and what I actually did do. So it allows me to actually check it in a way that I can use this information for such and such purpose, or they can use that information for such and such purposes.
Right, and if they were to go off and share that information and in its current form 1.1, and this is one of the things that both the ISI and Anchor are working on around notice, is the whole idea that if you've agreed up front to share the information with other entities, you need to have a mechanism in place to provide notice that that event has occurred, right? So
That's the receipt as notice.
yeah, well, so I always go back to the GDPR because I know the CCPA is it's still in flux, and eventually it'll get there. I don't quite understand why, you know, out of 50 states with such intelligent people, we don't, you know, there's probably a half a dozen different privacy and data use bills that each state is trying to put together. Why they don't all come together and work on it as one is kind of far beyond me. But going back to the GDPR, it's what data do you want? What are you going to do with it? Who are you going to share it with? How long are you going to keep it? And will you adhere to my right to be forgotten? Now, I just gave you the 5 key points of the GDPR, hopefully in layman terms and not the legalese terms that the GDPR is actually written in. And I know Jim will keep me honest with that one. But those are the five components that we focus on currently.
I would say, I'm not an attorney, but I would guess from all the conversations we've had that those first 4 are going to be required for any kind of data sharing. It's not to be forgotten yet here, but all those, what is, you know, what data for, who are you, what data, what for what purpose, under what time frame, and how is it going to be used? That's standard in terms of the kind of information that needs to be built into an MOU or a data sharing agreement here, I believe.
Yeah, more or less, but realize, like, for instance, there's already agreements with the EHR vendors to share data even under the label of de-identify, which de-identification is an entirely different concept in the way GDPR looks at it. You can't, as a matter of fact, I don't think, and Jim or Kay could correct me, I don't think you can use de-identification under GDPR. You can use pseudonymization, but you can't use de-identification because of the possibility of re-identification or risk of re-identification. But there's agreements for data sharing that way, or when you sign your HIPAA disclosure, if that means that your record is now accessible someplace else within a facility or a system by someone else, there should still be a consent receipt associated with the fact that you saw Dr. Smith today. You're being referred to Dr. Jones. Dr. Jones is accessing your records, and you never had a consent mechanism to say that they could look at it in the first place.
I just have one other quick question, I hope, before we adjourn here. When the FIDO folks were presenting a number of weeks ago, I think Kay or Jim, you guys had your reaction to that was, oh yes, that plus, Contera provides a whole suite of other things. And I'm assuming that those are the sort of the certification program and the assurance program. Was there something else? Because I was taken by that idea that FIDO was presenting. I'm just wondering if there's something there that that warrants clarification or maybe other information.
Okay, I'll let you take a swing at it because I'm not really a FIDO Alliance expert. I kind of said, yeah, just kind of followed along, but I can get from it.
Well, I can try. And I'm going to have to jump here because I have to get on another call.
I know we're in a double overtime.
Yeah, but so essentially, the Contera's accreditation program is broader, and it is very much technology neutral, right? So it's really about whatever innovation you've come up with, does it meet the NIST criteria? So is it protecting privacy? Is it secure? Is it done with rigor? Are you doing all the identity proofing and authentication, et cetera? And it's very broad because it covers NIST 863 version 3 is what we have right now. And A is identity proofing, and section B is about authentication, and C is about federation. So all of that is to say that it's very broad and it's very technology neutral. FIDO, instead of trying to sort of take on the whole thing, because Kantara had to create a whole trust framework. Kantara had to create criteria to assess against to know if you met these standards, right? It's very involved, and it's very in-depth, and there's a lot of detail there. FIDO has detail too, but what they chose to do was just focus on authentication. And what they've done is, as I understand it, and I can't speak for FIDO here, but
Sure.
they've essentially come up with some ways to do that authentication where they've provided the tools, if you will, for how to do that, to have secure authentication. They don't provide an AAL2, for example, authentication assurance accreditation, right? What they have is a FIDO accreditation. So it's much more focused, it's narrowly drawn, it's specific to the authentication, and they have specific tools that they offer, which they have developed over time. And I'm sure there's more to it. What Kantara is, ours was stood up, frankly, in conjunction with the federal government, right? Back in the FICAM days. So it was a different impetus, if you will. And so that's why I think the programs look different, but I think they're also complementary. And
Yeah.
generally speaking, if you have authentication using FIDO, you're going to have what will go towards that authentication accreditation. So I don't know, Jim, maybe you have a better description than I have.
I thought that was a great summary, Kay. I mean, I guess I look at it this way. Remember, there's authentication and authentication mechanisms, and FIDO looks to improve and streamline the authentication process. Then there's authorization, and authorization has its own model. And you have identity proofing associated with authentication and authorization, to which Kantara has a framework around the NIST guidelines for certification for how you do that identity proofing to support authentication in a digital identity environment. And FIDO is just a piece of it, I think, as Kay was saying.
Yeah.
Cool. That sounds great. Yeah, and as we think about the work we're trying to sort of stitch together here for this utility, there's because we're thinking more broadly than just healthcare, how can we utilize, sort of the best of to, make sure people are trusting that the information is being used appropriately, that it's being managed in an appropriate way, and that they are who they are, and they're not being spoofed, I guess is the right word. So that's great. So we're gonna, as we move forward on this stuff, and I'm sure we'll have more questions as we think about the actual consent utility, and we're starting to put that together. What are the pieces around that? And just as a closing comment, I had a conversation with Elizabeth Laird, who runs the Center for Democracy and Technology. They're very much focused on education, but also authentication and identification, and making sure that information is used appropriately. And in a way, they're almost a kind of an advocacy watchdog. So we're having this conversation about how do we make sure that we're, in a sense, proofing our models so that people actually do have comfort and understanding and trust that their information is accurate and being used appropriately, so as to sort of avoid that problem down the road, which inevitably is going to come up, especially as you start to deal with social services information and protected sort of 42 CFR behavioral health stuff and other things like that. So with that, any final comments before we sign off for the afternoon here?
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for coming, and Amanda
Indeed.
will ask you for your materials, so we'll post those on the site. And I know that there, as I said, some of the folks from California were here, and I know the number of other folks were really interested in this topic. So hopefully we'll be able to share that with them. And with all that said, be well, stay safe. See you next week.
Great one.
Happy Ash Wednesday, everyone.
Ah, yes.